Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm president of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and I'm the editorial director for States in Canada at POLITICO. I'm thrilled to welcome you today to our virtual discussion with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who will be talking about his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he is joined today by Robert Samuels, a national reporter for the Washington Post. My colleague Shannon Young, who covers healthcare for Politico's New York team based in Albany, will moderate the discussion. We'll talk about coronavirus inequities and how journalists can cover them. Shannon has been deep in this coverage area in one of the hardest hit states. One housekeeping note, we want this to be a discussion, so please go ahead and submit your questions anytime, beginning now and throughout the time that we're together, using the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll queue those up and Shannon will monitor them and begin asking them a bit later. Right now, I'll turn things over to Shannon and we'll get started with our discussion.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Kendi and Robert who are joining us today and be having this discussion with us. As Angela said, we're talking about Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and how lessons from that book should be used in journalist coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, but also just more generally in our own journalism practices. So I want to open up the discussion with just sort of giving us a sort of general background about what it means to be an anti-racist. And Dr. Kendi, do you want to just sort of walk us through, this concept and how you think reporters should be using it?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Shannon and Robert. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And I mean, very simply, to be anti-racist is to look out at the racial inequities and disparities in our country, even across the world, and not see what's wrong with particular groups, to not think that those disparities are the result of particular groups being inferior or superior, better or worse than others. It's to see those disparities and to see what's wrong with policies. It's to see what's wrong with a particular environment. And so from a journalist standpoint, for instance, if you're covering COVID-19 right now and you're trying to understand why is it that in Georgia, Black people are about 32% of the state population, but about 52% of the people who have died, what somebody who has racist ideas would ask is, what is wrong with the people? What is wrong with Black people? What are they not doing? What is essentially, let me try to figure out what behavioral or cultural problems they have and let me report that out. Versus somebody who has more of an anti-racist perspective will say, okay, what's wrong with the environment? What's wrong with the policies? What's wrong with the structures? Let me report that out to explain those disparities.
Thanks, Dr. Kendi, for giving us that sort of starting point. So I'm going to let you two just sort of take the conversation from here. Robert, do you want to walk us through some of the things you've been reporting on? And Dr. Kendi, you've also been very vocal on a lot of the issues that have come to light with COVID pandemic and how it relates to race. So Robert, why don't you start with just sort of what you've been doing, and then Dr. Kendi, you can take it from there.
Sure, I think Dr. Kendi's right. And I think similarly to when we're talking about racial issues regarding to COVID-19, we're not just talking about it in this sort of isolated frame, we're talking about it in a very broad frame because it is one of the indicators of larger issues within the country. Generally speaking, I've found that when people tend to look at racial issues, the big question that people attempt to answer is, well, what makes it different? You know, we're sort of still preoccupied with the idea that Blacks live fundamentally differently from whites. And so when we started looking at why Black people were dying at disproportionate rates, the first thing people would talk about is comorbidities, underlying conditions, respiratory infections, things that are true and exist at higher rates, as if those things by themselves could explain gross differences in people dying from a disease that's foreign to us, that has not been seen before. And typically, you know, it's very simple for a reporter to stop there. But I think this calls for a larger challenge. And I think the challenge is to challenge our assumptions about what drives our thinking about these issues, what it means for people to have the idea that, okay, I have underlying health conditions, why they exist, what's happening, and more so if the answer is convenient, if there's a convenient solution. I think if anyone can say in a simple sentence why Black people are dying at twice, 3 times, 4 times the rate in one particular place than in another particular place, there's something wrong with the reporting process, right? Because it's a multifaceted issue that encompasses lots of things. And I think it's actually a bit of malfeasance when it comes to reporting, to not look at sort of the issues about why these higher comorbidity rates, why these higher underlying conditions might exist, why it might be more difficult to do social distancing in a Black neighborhood as opposed to a white neighborhood. And then I think we can start to peel some of the systemic problems that have led to these really interesting disparities.
Certainly, and I remember very early on when I was a master's student in African American Studies, and I had just finished my undergraduate studies in actually journalism. And I'll never forget, one of my professors said that there's no such thing as objectivity. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm a journalist,
Yeah.
that's objectivity is key. And so she actually argued and went on to demonstrate that objectivity is nothing but a collective subjectivity, meaning, and going back to sort of what I was talking about earlier, if a journalist believes that there's something wrong with a particular racial group, and then there's racial disparities that they're more likely to be infected and die, then that journalist is going to be more likely to ask questions about what's wrong with that racial group, leading to those inequities. If that journalist believed there's nothing wrong or right, superior or inferior about any racial group, and there are disparities, then that journalist is not going to try to figure out what's wrong with the group. They're going to try to figure out what policies may be causing these disparities. And I also think that we're also collectively trained to individualize groups. And so obviously, I think as journalists, one of the ways in which we bring color to stories is by telling individual stories. And I think we have to be very careful are we telling an individual story that's representative of a larger phenomenon that we have evidence to prove? Or are we telling an individual story that then other people are going to take away as this is what's representative of the group? In other words, there's been so many sources that have been reporting out, I'm sure I should say, people who have been stating in stories that Black people are not taking personal responsibility for their health. Black people are not, specifically 2 weeks ago, Black people are not social distancing, they're not taking the virus seriously. And then that person would describe an instance of an individual Black person who was gathering with other people. And then the reader would then take away, oh yeah, that's why Black people are dying at disproportionate rates. When at the time there was evidence, there was survey data demonstrating that Black people were actually taking the virus more seriously than white people. So I think that goes, Robert, to when you were speaking about in terms of the negligence of the reporter, because I think it's critical for us to ensure whether the individual stories and even sources that we're lifting up, whether they can actually be verified.
Right. And I think the other thing about it, you're making a good point in terms of when you're choosing a single story, right? When you're choosing that person who you're hosting up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people as an indicator and an anecdote about what's going on within a particular community, you have to choose well. Yeah. And the way you choose well isn't necessarily, I think there's a natural inclination to go for sometimes the most provocative example. You drive around and you might see a group of people playing basketball and saying, oh, look, people are playing basketball. Clearly they're not social distancing. That's the end. You end it right there. but that's only one place within a certain community. And I think in times of tragedy, there is a tendency to sort of want kind of, I don't want to say this way, but almost sort of these like almost pornographic ways of viewing people who are struggling, you know, a way that makes it look like they're distant from everyone else, they have their own things, and that's why they make bad choices. And what that does for a reader is it amounts a sense of guilt, which can be very affirming to know that you can feel guilty. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't help people understand the scope of the issue. And one thing that I've learned in terms of reporting is that sometimes, if not all the time, it's better to have a person who isn't an extreme provocative example of something that you believe to be true, but someone who can actually walk through the nuances about why they're making the decisions you're doing. So when the numbers started going out in Milwaukee, we did this story looking at how coronavirus was playing out inside one neighborhood on the north side of Milwaukee. It's one of the most segregated, Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in America, and they're also seeing these incredible disparities between Blacks and whites. At that point, more than 70% of the people in the state of Wisconsin were dying who are Black, when only 6% of the people in Wisconsin were Black. It's one of the most gross disparities we had seen. And the moment you start speaking to people, they say the same thing, which is, you know, how am I supposed to stay at home? I have a job to do. My job's delivering food. It's taking care of the elderly. It's going to this factory that's still open. Like, I can't socially distance in this place. Also, you know, I come home, I live with 2 generations of people. I can't stay away from them. We're a unit. We need to be in this together. And these are the sort of things, conditions that are responses to larger systemic problems that coronavirus is exposing. And so the challenge, and it's a big challenge, I think, in a time when we're very limited in our movement, is to actually do the reporting, you know, and to start asking deep questions and more questions as opposed to looking for convenient answers.
Precisely, yeah. I mean, that person, we could certainly tell their story and then show data that Black people are more likely to be working in jobs in which they cannot work from home. And then Black people are more likely to live in multi-family homes. They're more likely to live in densely populated urban environments that, no matter the race, are susceptible to the contagion. Then they're more likely, thereby, when they go out into their communities to work, to come home and infect people in their home. And I know, at least in China, most of the spread of the coronavirus was through family clusters. And so what's fascinating is, through that individual story of somebody who, as you stated, is not this provocative extreme example, you know, we can essentially share all of this data, all of these studies that really speak to precisely why these disparities are negatively impacting a particular racial group. And I think, but in order for even us to tell that story, we need the racial data. And I think that's what sort of compelled, you know, my colleagues and I, as well as the folks at the COVID tracking project, to build what we're now calling the COVID racial data tracker, to essentially track the data that states are releasing, you know, in terms of the racial demographics of coronavirus, not only cases, but hospitalization and even in death rates, and then simultaneously continue to encourage them to do so regularly. Some states have released infection data, but they haven't released death data, or vice versa. Some states are releasing this data every day. Others are releasing it every week. And so we're also building a network to encourage them. And then we're also, of course, analyzing the data You know, but we wanting to make this data available to journalists that would make it easier for them to do their jobs.
And I just wanted to jump in and follow up on some of these points that you both are discussing. You know, as both of you have noted, there's been different data out of different states. What should journalists be doing in terms of holding lawmakers accountable? In New York, we had Governor Andrew Cuomo, who after New York City released its data that showed these racial disparities in COVID deaths, saying that he wanted to do a more comprehensive study, but stopped short of announcing any sort of actions. You know, how should policymakers be responding to this and addressing these longstanding systemic issues that result in these type of health disparities before we even saw COVID? And how should journalists be holding them accountable during this?
Well, I think one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, are we prepared to hold people accountable? And that is asking them questions about what they knew about where this thing was going to hit and what their preparations were. I mean, one of the things I think is true about crises is there's a tendency towards sort of doing these sort of, we're all in it together, you know, like America strong. And that sometimes can blind us to decision-making that lawmakers make at every level that could have helped them at least identify the problem or help people understand why this problem might be flaring up in a particular community than another community. So one of the interesting things about Milwaukee and these states that we know where we saw these great disparities, one of their first defenses, I think, is a fairly reasonable defense, which is, we know this is an issue because we took the first step in recognizing this might be an issue. It's true. We know there are problems in places that had an inkling that there might be a problem. It's also true that, you know, when you talk to leaders in Milwaukee, they will say, actually, when we thought about it, we did not have a plan to communicate the seriousness of this pandemic to Black communities, because the ways that we have communicated with them were through churches, sometimes school meetings, and community gatherings. And then one day we realized, oh, churches aren't meeting, schools are closed, and we have said communities can't gather. And then they had to reinvent the wheel. Now, I think we have to sort of like examine what's happening here, what the government is saying. It's saying that we have 2 or 3 ways to communicate with residents in one of the most segregated places in America. And I think for readers and for people who are watching this, that's an eyebrow-raising statement. And so I think there's kind of a culture of convenience when it comes to people trying to explain race issues. But there's an importance in saying, okay, what was your racial understanding before this happened? And how did it influence your decisions? And I think that's true like with this, and I think it's true with everything else, that in terms of when we report about minority communities, the first question is, well, what are you doing now? You know, you're in office, what are you doing now? Without actually looking at the background and trying to understand some of the underpinnings that people who make decisions have about how to do race.
Certainly, and I think generally there are 2 ways to sort of hold public policymakers accountable. There is, what literally are they doing right now to stem the spread of infection and death in the particular communities that are the most vulnerable? And then simultaneously, what are they doing from a long-term standpoint to really think through why it is that these communities were hit particularly hard? And I think it's critically important to be asking both questions sort of simultaneously. And I also think it's critically important, obviously, for policymakers to be thinking. I know Michigan has created a racial task force. I believe New York City has done one as well, depending on their objectives, the resources, and the questions that they're asking. That certainly could be something that's useful. But politically, some may argue that it's just being created to sort of deflect the questions from the governor or the mayor. And so I think it's up to the journalists to figure out, okay, what is the political impetus for the creation of these offices or task force? Is it truly to figure out in real time how we can sort of stem the tide, how we can do it from a long-term basis, or is it a political ploy to put those questions sort of over there? And I think it's critically important also for journalists to be on the front lines of course, holding these people, accountable.
The other thing, Dr. Kendi, is sort of the idea of what's not there. In terms of understanding issues like this, there is some prologue in the past, right? And we can start examining what states and governments where these disparities exist, which, shocker, is most of them, and start getting a sense on how they handle these sorts of issues. And I think those kinds of questions, where resources were put in the past and where people decided to, shoot their shots in terms of tackling this, it's a really important thing. And I think these are ways that we can start to build an idea of what the government response was and where some of the failures might have been.
And if I can also add very quickly, so part of the difficulty for policymakers and government officials, particularly governors and mayors and city council women and men and others, is chances are the decisions that they made, either through supporting a particular public housing project or through deciding against sort of re-envisioning healthcare or the availability of healthcare in Southeast DC, typically their decisions have led to these disparities, either directly or indirectly. And so, I'm saying that to say that is why they're going to be, I suspect, pretty hostile, or potentially continuously trying to deflect blame, because they obviously do not want to be blamed for these disparities, particularly from these constituents who they may be depending on for re-election. I know that I recently wrote a piece for The Atlantic in which I argued that we should stop blaming Black people for killing themselves, essentially. There was all this blame on Black people for why we were dying at higher rates. And I had a series of quotes, particularly from politicians, many of whom served large Black populations. And so it was very easy for those politicians to say, you know what, you and what you're not doing are to blame for these disparities as opposed to me. I mean, that was politically suitable for them to do that.
All right, guys, so I wanted to just start taking a couple questions that have come in. This one comes from Bonnie McLean. It says, why are we allowing the granularity of race when it describes a poor biologic proxy and merely a social and structural construct? We need to name the structural construct, not use race as a placeholder. Just wanted to get your takes on that.
That's a lot of words. I think the first thing is whether or not how you define race as a social construct. I think it's ancillary to the idea of reporting. The fact of the matter is that we have a situation where we have a disease that everyone thought was going to tear into the wonders of suburbias and the domains of traveling Americans, but it ended up actually hitting the communities that are often hurt when pandemics happen. And I think that in itself is the question that warrants the investigation about why this thing happens and why it continues to happen in particular communities. Whether or not race is a social construct or whether a person is biologically predisposed to a condition, I don't think is a real question journalistically. I think it's that's a different discussion. But I think when we're trying to measure and trying to understand the impact of this in our lives, and you see something so grave the question becomes, why are people being subjected to certain conditions that their death is being facilitated? That's my take.
And if I can add very quickly, I think one of the difficulties of talking about or using a racial lens when we are analyzing something that is considered to be a biological sort of phenomenon, or in this case, a health phenomenon, is some people, the fear is that, okay, then people are going to begin to consider race as a biological phenomenon and begin to think that, let's say, Latinx people are biologically predisposed to being infected. And so we can prevent people thinking that horribly racist idea, let's not even talk about sort of race. When in fact, I think what we can do, and I actually make a case about this in How to Be an Anti-Racist, is I view race as almost like a mirage. Meaning I think we should understand it as a mirage, meaning it's something that we can see. And because we can see it, and because it has real life impact, we should analyze that impact, report out that impact, while simultaneously not forgetting and ensuring that our readers know that it's a mirage. We can do both. Obviously, it's much harder to do, but we can do both.
Yeah, the other thing I think it's important is that you show the humanity of people, right? Yeah. That you do stories in which the only defining person of the people you're talking to is not their skin color, to make sure that people know they have families, they have hopes, they have dreams, they have lives. And I think that helps to sort of essentialize the issue. I mean, to me, the beauty of journalism is to be able to take ideas that seem far away and bring them close to home. And I think sometimes that when we report on issues of identity can take the forefront, when really one of the reasons to report the idea of identity is to show that these are living, breathing people with lives and hopes and dreams who are deserving on the earth as anyone else.
Yeah, and you guys touched on it. Sorry, Dr. Kendi, but a question from Juliet Beverly in the chat is, as an editor, we're hoping our eyes are ever so sharp in crafting the stories in the COVID-19 pandemic. What are some style issues that you've seen in reporting that have demonstrated othering or bias?
I think some of it goes back to where you tell the story. And whether COVID-19 sort of becomes a placeholder for any other issue that can happen within the community, and, I've seen times, it's like, if you're reporting on Detroit, where do you go in Detroit? Do you go to 8 Mile because you saw the movie and you heard 8 Mile was cool? Do you always go to the same neighborhood in Milwaukee and describe it in the same way? And those are sort of biases that show up inherently. And you see whole paragraphs that can be written about communities in any situation, just as a construct of poverty that isn't unique to this. And I think that's one of the ways in which bias shows, in which a reporter goes out, they talk about a community, and they find nothing different about the community than sort of the tagline that it's always known for. I think that's a very dangerous way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I came across stories, and after I was sort of looking it up, in which the reporters, so the source would sort of blame Black people, would say Black people are not taking the virus seriously. So to give an example, there's a USA Today story that quoted a Black mayor from Rochester, New York, who said, "I don't think our community is taking it as seriously, as it should." And then the reporter stated without quotes, you know, the message of social distancing doesn't seem to be hitting home with people still playing basketball, having card parties, and hosting sleepovers. And so essentially the reporter thereby verified the source. The problem with that is there are almost certainly people in white neighborhoods who are also not social distancing, who are also gathering together, who are also going to the park. And so, you know, going back to something that Robert said, he talked about, you know, trying to treat people, particularly people of color, as if they're human. What that means is even reporting out their imperfections, and then simultaneously saying that other groups are being imperfect too. So it's not, you know, it's not, the issue is not that Black people, the problem is not that, I should say there are certainly Black people who are not social distancing, but there are white people who are not social distancing, as we've now seen through protests all over the country. And so I think that was an example of that reporter could have stated that and then also said, but there are also people in wealthy white parts of Rochester who are doing these very same things.
Yeah, I think, and there's a very important distinction, right? You know, the question I sometimes ask is, wait, is this just for this community? Like on social media yesterday, we saw a number of examples in New York City of groups of people on Christopher Street gathering and suntanning, and people at the same time wondering why Mayor de Blasio had not sort of chastised these people with the same furor and specificity that he did with Jewish communities there. And I think these are really important points. And we've seen examples of communities that have both Blacks and Jews and no data. And everyone in the community is arguing, well, who's dying of COVID? Are they the Blacks or the Hasidic Jews? Which is a crazy thing to happen. I'm saying this to underscore two points. One, the importance of data in terms of being able to disaggregate what's actually happening in a community. But two, the importance of understanding a community and understanding some of the tensions that get played out in various ways. And, you know, the convenient narrative is that it has to be one or the other. Maybe both, you know, but these are things that people need to report.
And I just wanted to shift focus to some of these demonstrations we've seen against the lockdown orders. Susan Ryder has a question and says, some of the racial inequity I've noticed is the tolerance of armed demonstrations at state capitals, particularly in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania and Michigan. They're being tolerated with little action, you know, from police and whatnot, whereas there have been concerns raised, well, what if these people were minorities or of color? Just wanted to get your take on that.
I'm going to defer to you first.
I mean, that's precisely the question that a journalist can be asking. And I think one of the ways in which, in a very precise way, a journalist could be asking that question is if the city has the same administration that it had 4, 3, or even 5 years ago, when there was a protest against police violence, and there was a demonstration against that, not in the midst of a stay-at-home order in which people were free to demonstrate, for the reporter to ask, to figure out, okay, how did the police respond in that case to this demonstration, and then to compare it, and then ask the question of the mayor, ask the question of the police chief, ask the question of the city leaders. Why the difference? Why the drastic difference? And because I think one of the things that's happening is, you know, obviously I think, and I pretty much know, I mean, even in New York City this past weekend, there were these images of police officers in Black communities that were literally brutalizing Black people who were not social distancing. And then in Central Park, there was a picture of a police officer who was handing out masks to people who were not social distancing. And so this drastic sort of difference in the same city. And I think And so, you know, certainly journalists can be asking these questions and reporting them out.
Yeah, I agree. I think these things are matters of accountability. And also, if there are no resources to invest in that accountability story, it's a matter of doing some good archival searches to be able to draw the contrast between what's happening now and what has happened in the past, when one of the main differences is race. And I think we're getting better at this in the larger media scope, but the ability to call things as racial when they seem racial, you know, and to have those sorts of discussions, I think it's really important.
And then Jamila Bey in our Q&A section notes that the lack of diversity in a lot of newsrooms and how that's playing into this, the coverage of this pandemic, but also other issues. She writes, as we battle this pandemic, how do we recognize that Black journalists are in many places fighting a battle as well as to do their job in a way that does justice to the people they cover and the people who read and see their stories?
That's the eternal question, isn't it? I think the first thing that I think you need to notice is when, you know, we're in a mission-driven profession, you know, so like, I think when times get tough and times get crazy, we need to ask ourselves, like, all right, what's my journalistic purpose for doing this? And how do I live it? And sometimes that has to deal with the intensities of discussing race in a environment where people might not be so willing to discuss it. And sometimes it means being like, well, I can't, for whatever reason. I have to sit it out, and understanding and reconciling within oneself that both are noble, acceptable things to do. The other thing that I think is important is that discussing racial disparities is not necessarily solely the domain of diversity in your newsroom. Like, we are talking about simple, basic journalistic function and accountability. There are people within communities who are being disproportionately hurt by something, and that we need to do, you know, no matter the skin color of the reporter, the importance of diving into that issue, understanding one's prejudice and one's bias is still there. Like, the work still needs to be done. And I think a lot of these questions are fundamental journalism. You know, like, if you go out and you report a story and everything you get is everything you saw in your head before you went out, it's a bad story. Like, you're not going out and trying to figure out some of the nuances and some of the examples that help complicate issues, because life is complicated. You know, your lives are complicated. So it's a curiosity to me why it is that so often people write stories that feel so convenient. You know, like, if we're actually putting a mirror or a prism on people's lives, how is it that their lives are so much simpler than everyone else's? And so I think these are some of the questions that people need to ask. You know, like, yes, do we have prejudice? Absolutely. Lots of people do. Probably everyone does. Is there a bias? Yes, there is. Can you be a journalist? Can you do fair reporting even if you have a bias? Yes, you can. But the way you do it is by doing more reporting.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I certainly would love for more newsrooms to diversify. But simultaneously, I think it's critical for reporters and editors to strive to be anti-racist, no matter their race. And I think it's critical for white reporters to recognize that even a story that, like, every story presumably could have a racial component, that you may not have realized it going into the story. But to be open to that, I think is absolutely critical. I certainly don't think, I think, to echo Robert, that if a white reporter sees an incredibly important story with a critical racial lens that that reporter should then call up the Black or the Latinx, sort of journalist at, at the other desk, or actually now in the other home, and that they shouldn't take it upon themselves to do it. I think they should, potentially take it upon themselves to do it. So, because the more stories we're writing on all of these issues, the better. And especially if that story, so to give an example, a lot of these protests over the last few weeks had a incredible sort of racial component to them, as we just talked about. And obviously, almost all of the protesters, at least anecdotally, appear to be white. It's going to be very difficult. It's much more difficult, and I suspect Robert can share this, for a reporter of color to potentially report out those protests and the racial lens and components within them. It'll probably be much more difficult, even though many of these reporters are trying to do their best. Like, a white reporter at these protests can potentially ask questions, or get, more importantly, answers that could be absolutely critical. And so I think it's critical for white reporters to even see how they can utilize their whiteness in spaces in which it's much harder for reporters of color to do so, and to not be fearful in sort of doing so. I don't want to, go to that white supremacist sort of rally because those people, I just don't like those people, or it's going to be uncomfortable. So if it's going to be uncomfortable for you, can you imagine how uncomfortable it's going to be for a Native reporter? And so I think that's also sort of critical for people to see that as well.
I think also, if this is a concern everywhere, and one of I think kind of the delightful anecdotes that I have that's a little bit lighter than what we're discussing about is, I was working at the Miami Herald when we were seeing the reverberating effects of a massive earthquake that took place in Haiti. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And everyone's sort of looking for ways to tell the story, and up comes a story about what happened to all the pets that people in Haiti had. Now, how does a story like that get placed? Well, there's a reporter who likes pets, and she pitches the story, and she goes and she gets into it. So she gets it, and it ends up in the newspaper. Does it add to the coverage? You guys can do the decision on that. But the importance of that is that when people look at big, massive stories, we automatically start to divide them up. And we divide them up by our interests. Like, how does this, like, what's my piece? Like, what do I know in my life that can help tell this story? I think some of the challenges that every reporter has is to say, all right, what don't I know about my life that I want to know? Because that sort of curiosity is also helpful. I've gone to my share of all white events. And I've often said, in a very weird coincidence, sometimes in a lot of people who I report on, I'm the first Black reporter they've seen. I might be the first Black person they know. And in a lot of cases, I'm the first Black person who's ever stepped foot in their home, asking them intimate questions about their lives. And just by my presence of being there, they want to talk about race in America, because they feel like this is the shot. There's a Black person here. I want to know about, can you tell me this? Can we just talk about why Barack Obama was the worst thing that ever happened to this country when it comes to race? The amount of times I've had a conversation like that, just by the presence of me being just kind of different and asking a little question, it inspires a conversation. And I do think that when we're talking about some of the racial components of this, it's like everyone has a race. Everyone operates in a life in which they have a perspective that is influenced by how people perceive the color of their skin, what category that is. And one of the big fundamental flaws, I feel, is when we talk to white people, that they do not have a race. this, that, you know, there's a default, you shouldn't have to ask them questions about it, and there are no opinions. They're out there. It merits interview, it merits questioning, because that's what we do.
All right, so I just wanted to get one last question in before we start to wrap this up. It comes from Yvette Laganteri, apologize if I butchered that name. And it's, what do you see the role of journalists in reporting on community and grassroots organizing and activism to address the problem? You know, the models that have been successful may be replicated if reported widely. So I'll just let you guys take that.
One of the thing, you know, I loved Mr. Rogers growing up, and one of the things he always says is, in time for crisis, you look for the helpers. And oftentimes a grassroots community, those are the grassroots organizations, those are the actual helpers. And I think there are sort of two very different theories about this. Sometimes I think there are journalists who believe that people that close to the ground are inherently radical and thus unreliable. But in my experience, community organizations, people who actually know who's being affected, they're the gatekeepers to really understanding a community. And I think it's important to listen to them and hear them. One thing I will say about this, when we did the story in Milwaukee, I hooked up with a neighborhood group in a neighborhood called Metcalf Park. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that there were no grocery stores in the neighborhood. Well, there was one supermarket that was incredibly crowded. All the corner stores, which were really the lifeblood of the neighborhood, had closed. All the gas stations had closed, and the food pantries had reduced service because they could find no one to volunteer for them. There was, they had the food, no one to volunteer. And so this community group said, okay, if you have the food, give the food to us. We will go out and we will distribute it in the community. So here I am with them, picking up these boxes. And when they set the boxes down in their neighborhood office and they saw the abundance of things that existed, the things that they could not get in their neighborhood, it was one of the most telling pieces of reporting that I've done related to this issue. The idea that things were out there and it took a community group to go out and pick them up. To me, that highlighted the inequalities within that community in such a vivid way. And I think when we look at situations like this, I think it's important to know that there are always folks in every community who are trying to find solutions, and that we have an obligation to go and talk to them, because they will know more than any academic, any expert, or any piece of data can tell you.
I agree, and I think it's also important for us to remember that chances are there are multiple community groups sort of organizing in a particular community, and to not necessarily make one community group the representative sort of grassroots organization. But we can certainly tell a story through a particular grassroots organization, and even potentially through an individual who is working in that grassroots organization. I think historically, when journalists and even scholars, when we write on these grassroots groups, we tend to write on them through the personal stories of the leaders, because typically that's just much easier, or because they're pretty charismatic and they really add a lot of color. I think it's actually one of the things that I know scholars that we're really trying to sort of do is tell the stories of organizations through the everyday members or workers of those organizations. And I think we really sort of think through whether the leader or whether the worker would really be able to share the true essence of that organization and potentially that community. I suspect it'll be the worker. I suspect it'll be the person who, and so I think, that then necessitates another level of reporting. Obviously the leader will be the person who will get you access to that other person. I suspect the leader is going to want the story to be about her or him. And so obviously it's probably not best to say like, no, I'm not going to make it about you. I'm going to make it about, somewhere else. Then they'll close off access. But I really enjoy, I know personally, those stories that really report from the ground up, even when it comes to organizations. And they simultaneously tell organizational stories and community stories. So really, that individual worker is really serving as a guidepost for the organization's life, for the community's life, and potentially for the issues that the organization is fighting against on behalf of the community.
I agree, good points.
So just wanted to give you guys one last chance to make a couple points before we wrap up today. So is there anything that you just want to lead out on and make sure that people take away from today?
Yeah, I'll go first. I think, one, we're living in a very strange time when reporting becomes very difficult. And I think it is in times like these that people who are historically disadvantaged are exploited. And that shows in our coverage. And I think it's important for us to recognize that the very same concerns that we have about diversity of sources, diversity of stories that come in newspapers, how stories are presented, none of those fade away. And they're become even more important because of what we know about how this disease is playing out within the United States. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that, yes, this is going to be a little bit harder to do, but it's just as important, even more important, that we get things right. And just the idea that it's a little bit more convenient should not be a cop-out for good, honest, fair reporting on minority communities. And that is something that we shouldn't compromise.
Certainly. And about a century ago, in 1927, there was the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, in which the Mississippi River, because of months and months of heavy rain, basically overflowed both banks all the way up the coast. And tens of thousands of square miles of land was inundated with floodwater, and ended up being one of the worst natural disasters in history, which then led to these massive relief camps. And the Secretary of Commerce at the time was Herbert Hoover, who oversaw the relief efforts. And he was able to successfully suppress stories of massive amounts of racial violence and brutality that emerged in these relief camps, because almost 90% of the people who were victims of this Great Mississippi Flood were Black. And so as a result, you had the larger American public imagining that the relief efforts were going on great, and that Hoover was doing such a great job. And so then people started thinking of him as, he'd be presidential material. And then he ran for president in 1928 and then was elected. And again, that the sort of course towards his election was based on the fact that there was not enough reporting on what was actually happening in these relief camps. And to compare that to now, I think it's important for journalists to recognize that it's likely that this coronavirus pandemic will go down as the worst public health disaster in American history. And as an historian, I know that, as many journalists have heard, journalists are really the first writers of history. And so how journalists report on what is happening right now in real time is not only going to have political ramifications for the next, presidency, for the next, so for the way in which people understand the problem and how America should be recovered, but also for some time, how people are going to conceive of who the real victims are, who the real victims were, and why they were the victims. And we, of course, it's really on journalists to make sure that America gets it right. Meaning when people are reading and trying to understand what happened during the COVID pandemic in 2050, that they're reading a truthful story. I think it's on journalists to make sure that happens.
Thank you, Dr. Kendi, and thank you, Robert. I really appreciate you guys sitting down and having this conversation, even virtually. And I just want to let everybody know who's tuned in today that we're going to be sharing a link of the recording later today. But yeah, thank you guys so much. I think this has been a really great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon and Robert, and of course, Angela.
Yes, thank you, Shannon, for being our wonderful moderator. Thank you, Dr. Kendi and Robert, for being here. And I wish we had all day for this conversation. It is absolutely engaging, and really excited that we've had so fantastic participation from our audience. Even though we can't see you, we know that you're here, and thank you for being part of the conversation with your questions and via the chat here. Dr. Kendi didn't plug his book much, but I have no shame. So I will tell you that if you haven't bought it already, you can buy a signed copy of How to Be an Anti-Racist, the book that we've been talking about today, at Solid State Books. They're available online right now. The bookstore is closed, but you can still purchase online, solidstatebooksbc.com. You can also find that link via our website, pressclubinstitute.org. We also, at the National Press Club Journalism Institute, have a few programs coming up that we hope will also be of interest to you. You can find more information about all of these programs, as well as what we're doing to help journalists. And you can also sign up for our daily newsletter that comes out on covering coronavirus. You can do all of those things at www.pressclubinstitute.org. We hope to see all of you again soon at one of our programs, either virtually or eventually again in person. So thank you, Dr. Kendi, Robert, and Shannon, and all of you for being with us today.